And I'm back. One thing to note is if we do get that other house, the trip to the kitchen and back to recording would not be quite as quick.
That's a good leg stretcher. You know, I was also a little bit confused because I was thinking that mini LED was just a slightly bigger version of micro LED, and I'm wrong about that. It's not the leap forward that I thought it was.
I haven't read up at all on like mini LED, micro LED, and everything else. So like I have no realm of basis other than I've heard that mini LED would be the next step beyond OLED.
So mini LED is comparable to standard LED displays where you have an LED backlight. It's just that you have more LEDs, so you have more dimming zones. Whereas micro LED will be the step forward from OLED because micro LED will have its own. It'll be able to emit all of the colors from a single point, because that's what OLED does.
Okay, so yeah, I just had my terminology wrong, and again, I hadn't read about all of them anyway. So
you kind of haven't really needed to.
I normally assume I don't need to worry about it until I'm in the market for a new TV, and I'm actually like wanting to buy a certain like high-end type of TV and not just replace with like, you know, something that's a little bit better, or, you know, like there are two different types of TV buying situations that I find myself in. One is, all right, I'm ready for an upgrade because I hear great things about advancements in technology. And so then I'll research it and figure out what I want to get. And the other is, I just want a bigger screen in this space, or I have a problem with this TV and I need to replace it.
Yeah. The word I was looking for micro LED was self-emissive pixels. So no dimming zones there. You just have a pixel that is capable of all, being independently lit like OLED.
It certainly sounds interesting. It'll be neat to see.
Yeah. Well, I think so. OLED does that, but the problem with the OLED is that it is the burn-in issues that it has. So OLED is sort of the stopgap until micro LED becomes less
cost effective.
Yeah. And mini LED is just that's better than LED because you have more dimming zones. And again, it's not the same. It doesn't do the same thing as micro LED, but it's better than LED, and so it's something that we'll use until we get there. But I was confusing mini LED as each pixel being self-emissive when it is not. It's just better than the LED screen that I have on my computer right now.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But I gotta say, like, I really like this display. I've liked it for the last 4 years and change, and just waiting. I could get a replacement computer, but I don't want to because I don't want to deal with Motorola's MDM.
Is that an airplane?
Probably a car.
It's just muffled enough that I couldn't tell.
I also wish I'd gotten the silver. I like the silver better than the space gray.
Yeah, we just differ there.
Yeah, no.
And I think it's because of how much time I spent with silver laptops. I enjoy having something different. I would really like to see more of the raw titanium. I know the old PowerBook G4s weren't technically raw, but the paint didn't stick well to them, so they fairly quickly became raw.
Fair enough.
And that was a good look.
I don't think we'll ever see that.
Yeah, we won't. I mean, I'm glad that titanium is being brought back into products like the Ultra. And,
yes.
Admittedly, it was in some of the editions of the watch prior, but I don't think we'll ever see it on the laptops. It doesn't really make cost sense.
No, it makes sense. It does make sense on the watch because that is a typical metal used in watches.
Yeah.
Have you? I'm kind of disappointed that Apple doesn't have a titanium link band for the Ultra, but I did find one because I've been plotting in my mind about, or just thinking in my mind about getting the second gen of the Ultra, and I was like, ooh, it would be nice to wear this. It's titanium. It'd be nice to wear with a titanium band. And there's a company that sells a $200 color matched titanium band for the Ultra.
I know I've seen a couple of advertisements for them. It does annoy me sometimes that I don't have a nice, if I were to wear the watch out and wanted to dress it up a little bit for wearing out, I don't have a good band to do that with. But I also just don't have that use case most of the time at this point. Like most places I go, even if I'm dressing nicer, it's not that out of place with the bands that I have. So
I know you have the green Alpine loop.
I also have the white one or whatever. I don't remember what they call it, but it's the white one, the Alpine loop.
Okay. I was thinking about it because I was like, ooh, that it is a watch that you could dress up nice with.
And I've also got a handful of other bands from over the years that would still fit it. So I could do like the braided solo loop if I wanted to, and it looks a little bit classier, even though the band, like the clip-in spot, while it functionally clips in fine, it was a little bit shorter bar, so it might be a little bit off, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that most people would notice.
I thought they used the same size bar.
Well, this would be the largest.
That's right.
Casing that they've done. So I think this one is the one where it shifted a bit more, because I know there was a little bit of shift from the 42 to 44.
I think they did a 40 to 41 and a 44 to 45.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and try the different bands, but I know at some point one band in the previous Series 6 watch, there was a noticeable little gap at the end, or on the end, but it was only noticeable if you really inspected, like just looking at it, you wouldn't notice. But if you turned it and really looked at the attachment point, it was ever so slightly shorter.
I feel like I'd want one of each.
Of the new bands?
Yeah. Like I'm looking at that, I'm looking at the Apple Watch. Like I'm still in the place where, like, let's say that I had this revelation that I actually do like wearing an Apple Watch, and I will wear it on a daily basis, and I want it for the tracking that it does. If I'd realized that in October, I would have gone ahead and bought an Apple Watch Ultra. But now that it's like halfway through the cycle, and I was like, I will wait for the second generation. But I'm like looking at the first generation, like it's pretty, and I like look at all the bands, and I'm like, yeah, I think I need one of each, like an Alpine loop, what's the water one?
I think didn't they just call it like the Ocean Band?
Is it the Ocean Band? Yeah, I want one of those, and I want the thin band too. It's like $300 worth of bands.
Yeah, I mean, I've got easily a few $100 worth of bands sitting in the other room, just from over the years.
Oh yeah, I get it. I have stuff like that too.
So did you create a diagram?
I did.
Did you look at mine at all yet?
Did you send it to me?
I did not. I put it in the notes.
I did not look at them. Shame on.
I figured you wouldn't, which is why I put it there and didn't.
Is it an image?
No concern. It is.
Okay. Yours is like far more detailed than mine. Oh, I like it. Let me. What did you? I haven't messed around with Monodraw enough. Is that something you exported?
Yeah, you can export it as a PNG.
Gotcha.
I figured if you wanted the diagram at the end of it, I could just send you the copy of the file, no problem.
Yeah.
But I figured I would drop the image in the show notes just so it was easy enough to keep it all together.
I'll drop mine in.
Yeah, I cheated a little bit and went and got additional source material.
No, I like it. I was just, I messed around with mine, and how do you drop in without just dragging and dropping? Is there a way to like...
Oh, I just drag and drop.
Okay, I've never dropped in an image.
When you drag an image over, you'll get a cursor, where it's attempting to place it. That's how I've always done it.
Interesting.
I assume if you do like edit and attach file, it's the same thing.
I didn't see that option. Okay. It's Command Shift A. Huh.
So that would be attach file, yeah. It's always fun watching it in real time because I have an image block that I wait for it to fill until.
Does the line scan down like they did in 1998?
No, it just gives you the gray square image, and then like in this case I had to click off the note and click back to it, and it refreshed and showed me the image.
I was just sort of messing around, and for a minute some of my boxes didn't line up. So like if you notice that the boxes they're actually representative of years, like they are relative to each other. So
I like that.
I had something go kind of wrong when I got to Jinsey. I'm like, why is this wrong? And I figured it out and fixed it. But I'm like, why is the math not? I was like, why is the math not working? And so
so I think it's worth putting the images on the in the not the show notes, but on the page, the website page. So they'll be referenced somewhere if somebody wants to go look at them. But I think it's interesting the different mindsets that are obviously apparent in how to tackle the data. Like what makes sense. I mean, they both sets make sense. It's just you can really see when it's a fascinating idea, a very different approach to illustrating it, which is fun.
I kind of want to change one of the things I did there. You're 43, right? Or are you going to be 43 this year?
I'll be 44 this year.
I feel like one of the things doesn't quite line up.
Are you using the number of blocks to gauge it?
I am.
So when you're ready, I'll let you. Obviously, I'll shorten that time frame and include some of that as the build-up. But I'll let you actually state how you want to introduce it.
How do I want to introduce this?
Or do I need to be thinking of something while we're waiting for you to finish adjusting?
I think I know. All right, let me fix my image. I thought of like when I put it on there, I was like, oh, I don't exactly like this. So, okay. So I really don't know how to introduce this topic, but it was a thing that I came across in a TikTok video that just sort of fascinated me. And it's honestly, it's quite happily, I don't know if I'm happy about this, but it is how like a more in-depth analysis of how history repeats itself. Not so much that if you don't learn from history that you're doomed to repeat it, as history cycles again and again and again.
So the first couple of minutes, I was skeptical.
Me too.
It was one of those things that, all right, this sounds like it could be interesting, or it sounds like it could just be, a bunch of whatever. And then as it went on and as it talked about the different blocks and the way...
the seculums?
Yes, and the way the generations typically fall across those particular points as well, and thinking about general, proclivities to behavior and things that we've seen play out in general, a lot of things seemed to be accurate, almost eerily accurate, in a way that made it interesting to see, okay, where is this going? And then taking it a step further and seeing how these blocks of historical periods are bookended fairly well and line up in the way that's been described so far as being a repetitive cycle is fascinating. The scientific mindset, as far as the way I initially view it, the one thing I am skeptical of is whether this is actually a cyclical trend, or if it's only cyclical because of a limited subset of samples. But then I also, in my additional looking at some pieces of information, this has been a recurring thing that is not strictly applicable to American history, that it's cyclical in other areas as well, or other regions as well. And that made this even more fascinating once I stumbled across that piece. And so I don't know if it'll be easy enough to put the link to the original video in the show notes, but I'll put a link to the additional reading material I found in the show notes, at least, to give kind of an overview of that piece.
I think it's one of the things, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, I hadn't heard the term seculum, but apparently it's a pretty common term. I think I saw some places where it's comparable to the Greek concept of an eon. So it's not entirely. I just never come across it in this particular way, and I think the idea of the I guess to give some background, a seculum is roughly an 80-year time period, which is roughly the lifespan of a human person, and in that 80-year period, roughly every 20 years, in accordance with how generational cohorts occur, there are turnings, which is, basically a turning point. And at some point I dove a little deeper into this and started reading about social cycle theories. Anyway, you basically will live through a seculum, and it's broken down into 4 turnings, and these turning points repeat themselves. And they use the example of basically we're towards the end of the 3rd seculum in American history. And I'm sure I guess what made this interesting to me, and I didn't think it was some mumbo jumbo, was that it's a characterization of things that have already happened. The thing that was really interesting to me is that the book that this came from, that the TikTok user was Echo de Truth, and the book that he was pulling the information that he used to create the video from is a book that was written in 1997. And, they're able to look at I guess in 1997, they were sort of in the middle of the 3rd turning of the 3rd seculum of American history. So they have a lot of, they have 2 full seculums, 10 full turnings to compare. But, it fits. It's it's not something that you can necessarily use to predict the future, but it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of, it's an interesting characterization to see.
Yeah, one of the things that I found kind of fascinating about it was reading over, I guess, just to make sure there's enough background. within the 20-year periods, there are archetypes given for the people born or living in those periods, or who are shaped by those periods, is maybe a good way to think of it. And having those kind of correlate to the behaviors that we see in different generations and how those are cyclical as well is part of what gave it a little more credence in my mind, because historically we see patterns of behavior repeat in general, and from the social sciences side of it, it's never been explained to me in this way, but it lines up with what I've heard being discussed overall. And so it's, even though it wasn't explicitly the same, or quite as defined, if you will, having been exposed at least to that portion of the conversation kind of is what led me to say, okay, there's something to this. I'll keep listening and maybe dig a little bit into the background of where it actually comes from.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that I guess there wasn't a lot of explanation of the first seculum, but the second one, when we started naming generations like post-Civil War, post-American Civil War, you see the four turnings occur that in the last two cycles that really resemble one another. And those four turnings went into an order of a high, followed by an awakening, followed by an unraveling, followed by a crisis. And then it repeated again. And, I guess to give some validity to that, the second seculum, so the first seculum in American history occurred with the ending of the Revolutionary War. They had a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis that started with the crisis ended with the American Civil War, which led on to the second high, which would have been the babies born at that time would have been the I actually didn't know they were called the missionary generation. I hadn't gone back that far. I knew that the generation after them I knew about the lost generation. Those were the kids that were born during the second awakening. And then you have the second unraveling, which is the GI generation, and what's interesting is that they would be analogous to millennials, whereas the lost generation would be analogous to Gen X. Like, that lines up so well.
And as I was listening to the video, and they were talking about the archetype for those in the awakening periods, it's termed Nomad. We'll get into the because I find it fascinating. I'll explain the archetypes in a bit, but I've always referred to, in general, like my approach to so many things as wandering. And I've always held a certain amount of affection for not all who wander are lost, the famous quote from Tolkien, because I tend to float from one thing to another. I don't have to have a base of or a rooted, point of anything. Like it's fine for dealing with the unknown, and that fits really well. And then even though I hated in the video Elon Musk is the only Gen Xer referenced, and I hated that being the only one, so I had to go do some digging and found a couple others to add. But the way it was described as this being the generation that typically builds things and moves us from place to place in some fashion, and using Musk as that example with building rockets and cars and things like that, it makes sense. Generationally, from my experiences as a whole, and then from anecdotal evidence and overall stereotypes, it fits. We've never necessarily felt like something was home, quote unquote. We're fine existing here or with this or with that. Very fluid in our approaches, and that was one thing that just really kind of resonated as I listened to the video and made me curious about then the correlations between some of the other generations. And I think all of them make sense, other than the fact that I really don't like using the term hero for millennials, but I guess I'll take it.
In as much as the GI generation were heroes for the previous Seculum?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's just, did they have to use hero as the label for the archetype? I mean, I get why they did, but it's...
I was going to say it sort of fits like the sort of... I don't know, I feel like the millennial generation is like, I guess there's a reason why they call themselves millennials, because, Generation Y was too similar to Gen X. But the Gen Z kids didn't fucking care about being called Gen Z.
Yeah.
So, I feel like, I know the term is stupid, but I feel like the Xennial, I find that really interesting because you and I both kind of fit smack dab into that one.
Yes.
And
I do think... Go ahead.
I was going to say, I personally kind of like it. I don't like the name. I think it's kind of silly, but I do kind of like it because it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense while this sort of sub-generation exists in this little, period of time in between two generations because of what was happening that had nothing to do with, generational transference or generational divides. There's just, significant, it's not just cultural, but the significant world change, that we grew up with that makes us slightly different than other parts of our generation, other folks in our respective generations where we kind of match each other that I don't think we'll see with the other generations.
Well, it's something you definitely don't see with like Boomer to Gen X, and you definitely, from what I can tell, and it's a little bit early, but from what I can tell, there's none of that with the Millennial to Gen Z transition either. And I certainly haven't heard of anything with the previous Seculum's groupings either. So it is a very unique point where the acceleration of discoveries and technology and integration and all of those changes was hyper focused and hyper how would you describe how quick it changed? I'm at a loss for the word.
Exponential.
Yes. I mean, it just something that has not happened before.
I think historically the closest you could come to that is the Industrial Revolution. But I think because conditions were so bad, I feel like that's the wrong way of saying it, because conditions are drastically better for humans that were born in the late 70s and early 80s, were allowed to exhibit those differences. It's as previously mentioned before, like when Maslow's hierarchy of needs are not met, it's hard to really have characteristics. It's hard to be. It's if you're hungry or you need a place to live, it's hard to really explore what makes you different from what is socially acceptable.
I don't think I have a follow-up to that. Like, I agree. It's not that I just don't know that I have any statement to follow that with.
I think it's a pretty interesting description of things. In that I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that we've grown up through an unraveling and a crisis, and things have felt like they've gone from we're going from the frying pan to the fire, that it feels really difficult to see what is gonna take us from our from the end of our this crisis period that we're in to the next turning point being a high. The previous two highs were, or the previous three highs occurred because wars ended. The first, the Revolutionary War ended, and it kicked off a high turning point. The Civil War ended, kicked off another high. World War II ended, kicked off the third high. And so it's like, ooh, are we going to have a war?
I mean, there is. So I don't remember which show it was. We'd have to go back and look. But we did talk about, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a certain amount of uncertainty about what that really is going to spiral into. There still is. We're a year in, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about how far it's going to go and what it's going to mean. That could end up being the beginning of whatever occurs to get us to the other side. But it also could be like World War I, where it just falls somewhere on the timeline.
That's true, because that sort of but we've World War I might be analogous to the war on terror. True,
and I know in the slides there was a section, or in the video, where it called out the Gulf and Afghan wars were a portion, 9/11. All these different things that led up to, a certain point. It's like, how big of a crisis does it have to be to get us from the crisis block or period to a high? Because I think that's the big thing that's difficult to pinpoint, is that the current crisis block has been so full of things that have not gotten us, or maybe here's the better way to phrase it. Our current point in time has been so full of crises in general that it's difficult to imagine getting to the other side of something.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that, because me being an optimist has made me think, oh, great, what we have in store is a high, and that'll be great. But yeah, I don't, the doors that we have to pass through are going to be interesting. That's probably the scary part. And I don't think any of these seculums ever really had a nuclear scare, nuclear war scare, World War II ends, the United States did drop 2 nuclear bombs, but I don't think were we the only ones that had nukes at the time?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I think so.
Well, I guess what matters is in 1946 we were not concerned about mutually assured destruction, whereas 2028, a lot of folks got nukes.
Yeah, I don't know the exact timeline, but I don't believe the threat of nuclear retaliation actually came about until the 50s.
Yeah, the Cold, it was the Cold War,
right? But I was trying to remember anything that I heard timeline wise, and I don't think I ever actually heard specific timelines, but we definitely had a period of a few years where we being the United States, were the only nuclear power, but it wasn't drastically longer. It was within a few years that other nations developed nuclear capabilities. and by other nations. Obviously, I'm specifically referencing the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, but there's even more now. There's the former Soviet Union. There's England, France. It's a lot of them.
Yes. Something that came to mind that I realized we hadn't stated is actually that for the current Seculum, the year ranges to get a feel for what we're actually talking about if you don't have a handy diagram in front of you. So the current crisis block began roughly 2008. And if you think that these blocks are roughly 20-year periods, it means that
they are
the estimated, well, not all of them.
Yeah.
So they're roughly 20-year periods. And so the estimated time or transition from crisis to a high is sometime around 2028.
If you notice in my diagram, I put a squiggly line to represent maybe, approximately.
Oh, I see it now.
It's
I didn't see it at first.
It's the character above the tilde.
I
thought it was clever.
I just hadn't looked that close. Like I got the rough outline, but I figured I would come back to looking at really close at the diagrams for any little details like that later. Because I actually went back on my original diagram and added the Xenial generation. I liked that touch.
You added what?
The Xenial microgeneration.
Yeah.
But so thinking about if we're currently in 2023, we're saying sometime between now and another 5 years before we come out the other side. And this has already been a really depressing block of time for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's so interesting to think about. Like I was looking at the way you have your diagram laid out, and it's like the previous crises turn was 1929 to 1946, and it's like, what did it's very clear to me what kicked off that crisis, and it was, I think we could even like go down to the day. Was it Tuesday, October 9th, I think, 1929?
That sounds right.
I have to do real-time follow-up.
Yep. No problem. That's why I paused.
October 24th, Black Thursday. So that turning, that has a specific date. I feel like the crisis turning that we're currently, hopefully towards the end, we know it was 2008 with the.
Well, we know it was a financial crisis.
Yeah. But I don't think it had that one specific day.
No, I think that was more. It was still kind of fluctuating over the span of a couple of months, and. Mm-hmm. There was a question on how bad it would get, and then it got
bad.
Yeah. Kind of like what we were experiencing so far like last year, this year, with the questions on inflation and not sure, are we doing enough, not doing enough? Like, is it going to hit a really bad point, or are we going to be able to kind of ride this a little bit further and it be not so bad? A soft landing.
Are we on our way up, or are we on our way down from how bad it's going to be?
Yeah. But it also, one of the other things that was fascinating to me, and part of it I think is just related to the shorter history. Like the video specifically calls out, time of crisis or war, but all of our turning points have been focused on conflict, on war. And that's, depending on how you want to view it, that's not a very good feeling for how the current turning point is going to end. But it's also, if you think about how young the country is overall, it's also potentially fairly indicative of most of the time in established countries, maybe it's not war, maybe it's something else. And we're starting to reach that point. Go ahead.
I've kind of wondered if it's going to be the culture war.
I mean, my mind went there as well. Mm-hmm. So here's my concern. This is just me being me for the most part. But the Revolutionary War, pretty easy to pinpoint, pretty easy to understand, right? In general, that's the beginning of these particular points. The Civil War was very much, or it is very much, something that you could compare current divides to and not be far off from how the rhetoric and the speech and everything surrounding them is. If you think about, instead of a geographical divide, an ideological divide, we're basically right back at that point. So my general fear is that we're going to see a cycle of kind of a rallying together and dealing with conflict like you would see with the Revolutionary War and World War II, and a divisive internal conflict in opposite cycles that you could see with the Civil War, and then let's just say the ideological war or culture war, however you want to describe it for this turning. There's a limited enough sample set, and I am pessimistic enough leaning in general to be really concerned that we're not going to see an alternating pattern at the end on these blocks. And for anybody that's having difficulty following along, when you see this diagram and the way it's drawn, this alternating block pattern makes a lot more sense. So visual aids will be available. But I can make correlations between the Revolutionary War and the World War II. And I can make correlations between the Civil War and the feeling of the current ideological political climate. And that is really the thing that has me concerned, especially when considering how well these cycles line up overall.
Yeah, but if you notice, I don't know, does it feel like that the wars are, or at least the last two, like the Civil War, I think was worse than World War II in certain ways, as far as, I don't know, I'm not sure if I know how to articulate what I'm thinking, but in the American Civil War, it's like so many Americans died. Like it was 100% American death, I think.
I mean, if you're just looking at body count, I guess the current crises, if you take into account the COVID pandemic being a part of this particular crisis block, what percentage of the American population has died already compared with the same crisis block leading up to the Civil War? I certainly don't have any answer for it, but that would have been a time frame where I would expect general hardship to take more lives as well, as opposed to the same crisis block for or leading up to World War II. So I guess in general, what I'm kind of getting at is, does the amount of it being completely contained internally to the United States really matter with these blocks? Or is the question more a matter of, in these alternating crises years, or crises blocks, not years, is that more where your thought went to? Like, I guess I'm having a little bit of trouble following where the Civil War being purely American casualties makes much difference when looking at this at a overall like hierarchy scheme.
I guess some of the thoughts were that you have, a civil war feels worse in the sense that you have, the whole brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor sort of thing. It also feels bad because a lot of what led to the Civil War is just really horrible. Like, the atrocities that were committed in the South to people of color were, not something that you ever really learn about. I think I was sort of exposed to how bad it was. Well, let me back up. If you grew up in the South, you got some bullshit education about the American Civil War, and there's so much, lies, straight up lies and propaganda from that education that it took a fantastical movie to really expose me to like the atrocities that occurred in the South on the plantations. And it doesn't seem like things are bad for people. Things are not great for people of color. Things are not great for trans people, but it doesn't seem quite as bad as it was before the Civil War started. And what kicked off this crisis block that we're in was the financial crisis in 2008, and that doesn't seem quite as bad as the Great Depression. So that was kind of the thought I had about are these crisis blocks softening? I don't know.
So I certainly follow. I have a few points. Before I get to them, one thing I want to emphasize, just for anybody listening that doesn't understand the reference to like lies and propaganda with teaching aspects of the Civil War in the South, there are actually different textbooks by the same publication or publisher, where one version of events is outlined and illustrated in the exact same edition of the book for the Southeast versus the exact same edition in the book for other parts of the country. And the emphasis on the focus of the war in the Southeast, what's taught in education in the Southeast, is that the Civil War was very strictly a battle over what rights states have and where those rights get drawn and lines get drawn, as opposed to what the federal government can and can't say states can do. And the reality is that that's not truly what the Civil War was fought over.
When someone brings up that states' right bullshit, I was like, yeah, states' right to own slaves.
Correct.
Right?
Slavery was absolutely at the heart of the conflict. It's just trying to phrase it in a way that didn't mention slavery, except that the states that seceded mentioned the right to own slaves and the Articles of Confederation for succession. So, none of these arguments make sense. But I just wanted to mention that there are actually the same publisher will publish the same title with different information for region in the United States. And that alone, just that fact that you can easily go look at and see, tells you there's a problem in what's taught in some places as opposed to others. So this is not at all interpretation or perception or anything else. It's very much something that can be proven. And so I just wanted to emphasize that because I feel like that gets overlooked pretty often. Now, if we pivot back to, I have a number of points. So back to the discussion at hand. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to learn more about that, you can find some reading about the lost cause. I think that's where it started.
I'll do a quick search for it and see if a link pops up and include it in the notes.
The lost cause is, I know the Wikipedia article would be neo-Confederates, but it's the movement to reconcile traditional society with the southern United States.
So back to my general points, because I think at a glance, I would be inclined to agree that maybe they're softening. But then I think about, as you were describing, aspects of the Civil War, it's not different at all from what we've seen recently with I'm just going to call it Trumpism, or the embellishment of Trumpism within ideological circles, where it's the same, I'm going to have my way by God or you're my enemy kind of mentality. Does that kind of make sense?
No. It does line up, yeah.
And so I feel like there's a very strong, very emphatic reaction still present. The question mark on whether it's softening or not is whether it ends with the insurrection attempt on January 6th, or if we see an encore of some sort in the coming years. And that's a question mark. So if the only violent portion of this downturn is, let's not phrase it that way because that's not accurate. if internally to the United States, the only violent outcome is the insurrection attempt, and the rest of it is more focused rhetoric and not complete violence, I think I would agree that maybe these crises blocks are softening a little bit. But the problem is, as mentioned previously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine still has the potential to be a powder keg of violence beyond what's being seen in the region. And that's what made me kind of stop and rephrase. If internally it's just that attempt and the rest of it is more focused ideological rhetoric or propaganda or whatever, and from the outside, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine does not spill over into greater geographical areas and still remains isolated, kind of in the way it is today, where there's aid, there's some talk, there's some sanctions and things, but it's not turning into further aggression with other countries joining in, like truly joining in, then I think I would agree that over time, these crises blocks as a whole are maybe in a softening trend, but there's still too much unknown over the next couple of years to feel like that's an accurate representation.
Yeah, and as you were talking about it, I think maybe softening isn't the right word, and I was thinking maybe intensity is not the right word, but it is there seems to be a significant the loss of life seems to be significantly reduced. The dramatic effects of the economics seem to be reduced. Which is interesting because the unraveling generation that were growing, the GI generation that were becoming adults at the previous crisis turning, ended up having more financial wealth than the current cohort that was born during the most recent unraveling. And it's to the extent that it will never be recovered. So in one sense, it doesn't, we weren't over here, boiling leather to make soup, but
yeah.
But we will never recover from the the multiple once in a lifetime economic downturns that we've lived through in our at the beginning of our careers.
So it's interesting. I think this is a good point to kind of outline the archetypes that I mentioned before, because one of the things that I found fascinating digging into this a little bit further than just the link that you shared was that the prophet archetype, which would correlate to those shaped by the highs in society, tend to actually influence and bring about the demise of,
Yeah.
They lead us to the next crisis, whether willingly or not, historically speaking. And we're seeing that play out now with, so the prophet archetype would be applicable to the boomer generation. And we're seeing that play out with things like the Make America Great Again slogans and, people who are very focused on the new set of ideals that founded the sense of community and interaction within society during the time that they were growing up and formed, that are not applicable now. Or that are not inclusive, or there are many ways to go about explaining that. But it's fascinating that has been a trend that has actually been observed over these historical periods. So I think it probably makes sense for me to do just a quick high-level overview of the 4 archetypes. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm.
So mentioned that the prophets are those that are shaped by the highs, as far as the beginning point of these saeculums, the first 20-year period. And they're typically born after a great war or crisis. They are raised during a time of revitalized community life, and they see a transition to new foundational values in their society. And it's a period of just general affluence and success, and they tend to have fairly strict adherence to values, and are, as a result of that, are very idealistic because they grew up in a so-called societal high with low crime, high optimism, and lots of focus on the indulgence of children and families. The next archetype would be the nomad. The nomad would be those who are shaped by the awakening period, and they typically grow and mature during a time of spiritual revolution. You've got changing ideals and different spiritual agendas that result in youth pushing back against the established institutional order, which tracks very well with what I can think of from Gen X and the lost generation. And they tend to begin as underprotected, exposed children who grow into rebellious teenagers and then come of age as isolated, security-focused young adults, and then eventually calm into very pragmatic and realistic individuals in a kind of post-awakening portion of the world. To post-awakening referencing moving into the next, or taking the transition into the next turning, which would be the unraveling. And that's where the hero archetype comes into play. And this is where it's a group that's often born to overprotective parents. And there's a point of, or a general time of individual pragmatism and self-reliance with kind of a laissez-faire attitude. And chauvinism is typically aggressive or exaggerated. And patriotism, or the way it's phrased here, the approach to patriotism and the focus on government is more on a hands-off, more in a hands-off approach, or lack of desiring that interference. And generally speaking, there's kind of a general approach of let my life have its own course. Is kind of a good way to think of it. Following the hero archetype and the unraveling are those who are shaped by the crisis block, which is what we've really focused a lot of our discussion on, and they're referred to as the artist archetype. Artist generations are typically born during a great crisis, usually a war, but it could be some other crisis in general, and they grow up with overprotected, crisis-concerned parents. They become sensitive, socially focused adults and develop as fairly indecisive leaders during another generation's spiritual awakening, which is, I find funny because it's a very clear reference to their indecisive leaders while the next Nomad generation is kind of coming into their own.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that the prophet archetype's children are the hero archetype, and the hero archetype's children are the next prophet archetype. And the same thing goes for the nomads. The nomad archetype's children are the artist archetype, and their children will be the next nomad archetype. I find that really interesting.
So one thing that I found helpful, because the archetypes can be difficult to kind of wrap your head around, I have a few examples of the archetypes labeled in my diagram as well. And so just for a quick refresher, prophets, nomads, heroes, artists, in that order. And so examples of prophet archetypes would be Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. Makes a lot of sense. People who really did a lot to spread their values to the world at large. And then I already mentioned that I disliked Elon Musk being the only Gen X reference. Nomad archetypes as a whole, though. So Elon Musk, George Washington, Barack Obama. I found that very fascinating when I started looking through some of the additional reading that those folks were lumped into the nomad category. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think that can be a different discussion. And then example heroes would be hospital workers from the video that you shared.
Yeah.
And then Thomas Jefferson and Mark Zuckerberg. And that makes a lot of sense, actually, when you think about it, if you take a step back. And then example artists, I decided to just stick with the video on this one. It mentioned Herzog and Bob Dylan. Artists are pretty simple, I think, to understand out of the different archetypes as opposed to the others. And so that's why I wanted to also include the examples. But it does make a lot of sense. You don't have to agree with them. That's the big thing that I kept having to remind myself, that while representations or examples of these archetypes within the generations are people that, for some of them, are people that I may not agree with, we're not talking about agreeing with viewpoints. We're talking about behaviors and their contributions to society.
Yeah. Characterizations of who they are.
Yes. And those actually do fit really well.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. I think it's interesting that you've I feel like in your example of nomads, well, you didn't like Elon Musk, and so the two that you did put in are George Washington and Barack Obama, and I'm like, which one of these doesn't fit?
Yeah.
It's George Washington. He owned slaves.
The only reason I put both of them in it, because I did feel like Barack Obama made a good counterweight to Elon Musk. But I when I saw George Washington was classified in the same group, it's like, no, I got to put both.
So some of the other things that, like I pointed out, I was pointing out how the prophet's children are the hero, and that cycle tends to occur. But it's also like, the prophets are also the ones that are that have become adults that are making decisions that create the unraveling that their hero children are born in. And when you look at it, the reason why, that generation is, like, or why millennials very much dislike boomers, and, there's a lot of contention there. It's like, hey, it's because our parents are annoying the hell out of us.
Yeah. So one of the things I thought about doing was making or going back and putting more pronounced year blocks on the diagram, because it's one thing that I do feel like is lost, even though I include the data overall, is it's tough to track the way I have it diagrammed, what it actually means if you are like 10 in this block. What are you in this block? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because what's really neat is if you take a step back and think about it, if you were really shaped overall by the most recent high period, like you were born toward the early end of that, you have a very different experience for the awakening and unveiling, unraveling. The awakening, I had to actually, I was trying to remember it from memory, and I finally decided, no, I need to go look. Awakening and unraveling. Those periods than you would if you were born at the end of that high period, because you would hear stories of how it used to be, and you would think about how much that appeals to you because you have that same desire for those ideals and values that are being described. And I don't know of a good way to encapsulate that on the diagram.
So in the image that I created, I kind of did that for you and me personally. And if you look at our blocks, I had them. I now have them cut off like where we are today, and you are, you were born at the end of an awakening, or an awakening turning, and so, and I was born at the very beginning of the unraveling that we lived through, and it's kind of interesting to think about how it's like, oh, we've only really known unraveling and crisis.
Yes, it's
and we have a high and an awakening to look forward to.
Well, at least we hope history repeats itself.
Yeah, right. One would hope.
And the other fascinating thing about this, which I know we briefly mentioned about the whole microgeneration there's so much that's different with this overall seculum as a result of that microgeneration, or that point in history, that it's difficult to really wrap your head around how much that influences the difference between historical awakening period, shaping of minds, and historical unraveling period, shaping of minds, as opposed to this one particular transition and the three distinct categories that we can see over the course of these two turnings. I feel like that's really difficult to explain, but I think it makes sense. Like it's fascinating because there's an unknown variable here that may or may not repeat itself ever again. And I think the main reason it's fascinating is because it's directly related to my experiences.
Yeah, that's what I do have a fondness for the idea, because it is a very one of a kind occurrence, maybe at least in a lifetime, or a lifetime and a half. Where I imagine a similar, like I said, I think a similar occurrence might have happened during the Industrial Revolution.
And in fairness, technology is a strange, wily beast. The current proliferation of AI-assisted computing in some fashion feels like it could be another one of those periods. And if so, then it's not as unique as it seems now. But it does seem unique now because we don't really have a good correlation prior, other than if you want to make which I do think is a valid, correlation. If you want to make the Industrial Revolution be, this has happened before, it's not completely novel, but it is different each time it happens, kind of argument. And the AI piece could very well be the same kind of thing. It's a little early to tell, but it does have that feel where either it's the same kind of thing or it just kind of fizzles and isn't. Kind of like augmented reality could have been the same kind of thing, but it ended up so far not really being that thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And, I feel like this episode is going to be really tough to listen to because it so much pivots on being able to look at these diagrams and kind of understand what we're talking about. So just as we're kind of wrapping things up, I want to encourage you, if you have not, pull up the diagrams. It really does help make the conversation make a lot more sense. Because without them, I think it's just nonsense babble.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I love what you did. Like, I thought about doing something like this, but I was like, no, I want to go in a slightly different direction. The video has this, but now that I look at how you've done, well, yours has a lot more detail than the video, or a lot more, I feel like, relevant detail that the video did not have. And you went seeing it all like this. It's like, I just see patterns here that are really interesting to me. And as we've talked about this, I've thought about more blocks that I want to add to mine, like the Vietnam War and the War on Terror and the Cold War, and it's a lot of wars.
But I mean, it's a good point to make, because like this, I feel like this sets the stage for, okay, we've seen this thing, and there's a certain amount of interest that it's gathered. I want to take it offline and dig deeper and come back to this conversation.
Me too. I thought about a war line because I was just thinking about there was a lot of pro-America propaganda that occurred during the Second World War that led us into this high turning. And then if you think about the Vietnam War that occurred during the awakening, it was a very different war, and that was very different than the Cold War that occurred during the unraveling, and the War on Terror that's occurred mostly during the crisis phase, or the crisis turning that we're in. And it kind of makes sense in that it's like, I guess thinking about the War on Terror, like, it really fits the crisis era because there is no end to the War on Terror. It's a war on an ideology, not a war on an enemy.
Well, it's like, so fascinatingly enough, like one of the things I was thinking about is I'd like to map out the war on drugs.
Oh God, yeah, that's a good one.
You
I'm
know,
gonna put the DARE program on there.
Like there are so many other things that now that I have these date ranges, I kind of want to fill in a lot of gaps and see what things influence transitions from one turning to another versus what kind of patterns I see in those transitions, not just the entire seculum.
Yeah. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.